I've learned about El Salvador so far. So El Salvador in the past was inhabited by some Maya people, just like a lot of Central America. Then the Spanish conquest came to El Salvador in the 1520s. It became part of Spain, like a lot of the region. Then in 1821, El Salvador won independence as part of a kind of republic of Central America. And then in 1841, it developed its own independence as a country. And at that stage, there was a group of families called Las Catorce. So it was the 14 richest families of El Salvador. And then they had a oligarchy and they controlled much of the economy. And the economy for most of that time was mainly coffee exportation. That's changed a little bit more recently, but that's what happened. And the 14 richest families had control over the government, over a lot of other institutions in El Salvador. And in fact, even now, there's about 8 businesses that own a lot of El Salvador and have a lot of power, especially in recent history, which I'll touch on later. And they're actually descendants of those 14 families. So that's one element of controversy. So from about the 1930s till about 1980, there was various different military or civilian military dictatorships. They were often put in power by the oligarchy, the 14 families, and there wasn't really a democratic process, and there was a lot of corruption, and life generally wasn't that easy for Salvadorians or people like that. And then in 1979 to 1992, there was a civil war. So there was the government right or far right party, and then there was a kind of rebel far left party. And like a lot of other kind of wars in the developing world, they were funded by different parties. So the government organization was funded by the USA, and then the other organization, the FMLN, which later became a political party, they were funded by Cuba and communist parties. So you had this civil war that went on. There were a lot of civilian deaths, about 75,000. There was a lot of human rights abuses, and life was very tough for people. And that's why there's such a big diaspora of Salvadorians that don't live in El Salvador. So there's actually millions that live abroad. So there's between 2 to 5 million from what I read. And in fact, one of the biggest economic contributors to El Salvador now is money being sent back in from people, especially from people in the USA. So, but people obviously were fleeing war and difficult circumstances. And then in 1992, there was a peace agreement. But it was quite a tentative peace, so there was no winner of the war. It was UN sanction. And then as part of the peace accord, the government forces like the National Police, the National Guard, the army, the forces were all reduced. There was a demobilization of armed forces, and it was agreed that they wouldn't be involved in civilian affairs. So just park that until later. So, but there was lots of need and there was lots of challenge still in El Salvador at that time in 1992. And I guess there were a lot of people that didn't really know what to do with themselves. So that's when gangs, or I think they're called maras, that's when the kind of reign or the terror of the gangs began from 1992 and kind of until now. So there's actually been more deaths apparently during the gang times than there was in the official civil war. And there's 2 big gangs. There's MS-13 and then there's Barrio 18. So it's quite hard to describe how much power that they actually had. Like, I would recommend just to visit the country and speak to locals, because it's quite heartbreaking, really. They were, I think, correctly labelled by the government as terror organisations, and they terrorised innocent people, and if you speak to a local that's lived during that time, then they'll have stories by themselves or their loved ones, I don't know, being killed, threatened. Like it's almost like a bad movie, you know, where they control so much power. You'd have to pay rent. There'd be extortion. There'd be really arbitrary laws. Like you literally couldn't go from one area to another because if you were identified from that postcode or area, your life was at risk. Like just one guy, that I stayed at in Airbnb, he shared like loads of stories, just his life, and he's a professional now. He's like got an economics degree, but the kind of life that he had growing up, like he had to move a house at one point because some gang members, you know, just put a gun through the door and said, you know, give us your money, and they tried to shoot him, but the gun backfired. And then another time he just went to visit a friend, you know, as you do, go out. And on his way home, some gang members found him. They ask for your ID to see what area you're from. They ask you to take your clothes off to see if you've got any tattoos to identify from other gangs. They took all his clothes, took all his money, everything, and said, you have 30 seconds to leave our area, and if you don't, we're going to shoot you. So there's countless stories like that are quite heartbreaking, and people try to flee, and some people were forced to join the gang, or if not, then you die. And just a complete reign of terror with that. And I guess lots of people joined the gangs because they wanted, I don't know, meaning or purpose and brotherhood. And lots of these young gang members had no father or no set father figure. And it's crazy because you hear stories of the gang members treating it like a job. So I think it's crazy how wicked the human mind can be. So they would, like, you know, get their hair ready, put on nice clothes, even pray to God, you know, Lord, help me for my work today. And then they'd go out, kill, steal, extort, lots of atrocities. And there was the government parties, there was like a two-party system. So there was Arena and FMLN. And there was a president from one of those since 1989 until 2019. There was a president, and there was lots of corruption and lots of controversy as well, because the government actually in 2012 to 2014 tried to basically buy the gangs and have a government truce. And that didn't really work very well because the gangs wanted more power, and like I said, the government in their pocket, and the oligarchy, I guess, weren't too fussed because they were getting money. So there was just a lot of corruption, and people's lives were terrorized. And then actually in 2015, then the killing got out of hand, and I think in just 1 month, like in just the month of August alone, there were almost 1,000 homicides, and El Salvador at that point had the highest homicide rate in the whole world. It was one of the most dangerous places in the world to live, and the government, I guess, were powerless to stop it. Then you fast forward a few years and you enter the current president. So his name is Nayib Bukele. So he was a millennial, so now he's in his early 40s, and he wanted to kind of make change or stuff. So he was the mayor and he was very popular. So he decided in 2019 he wants to run for presidency. He was part of the left-wing FMLN party, but he fell out with them over different policies. So he decided to make his own party called Nueva Ideas, which is New Ideas. And he won the 2019 election with 53% approximately of the votes. And he said he's going to make El Salvador more economically prosperous and to take back control from the gangs. And it's amazing because he actually has managed to do that. So he lots of different stuff happened, but in his early part of the presidency, the homicide rate started to gradually come down from like 107 homicides per 100,000 to about 38 per 100,000. But this was still one of the highest in the world. And there was some allegations from the USA that he'd also tried to do a bit of a deal, like maybe not buying the gangs specifically, but he tried to make some sort of truce again, which he completely denies. But the homicide rate kept coming down and down and down. But then in March 2022, there was a day where over 100 people were killed, and commentators think that it was to do with the gangs wanted more power from the government. And I guess at that point, he was fed up, and he'd been in power for a few years, and he decided to institute a state of national emergency. So they had an emergency meeting in the government, and they said, okay, we're going to have 30 days, and it was basically like a crackdown. And do you remember after the Civil War, the army would demobilize for civilian affairs? So he reversed that, him and his party, and basically it was like martial law, where they he declared full war against the gangs, hence why he used the army and a kind of national guard. And then he started what is a 7-phase plan to kind of end gang stuff. So he basically went and rounded up all criminals, all gang members. He paused certain constitutional rights. So there's a lot of controversy in the international community and with human rights organizations, stuff like having access to a lawyer, being able to be detained only for a few days before being released, having certain privileges in prison, because a lot of, just like those movies, like people will be in prison with telephones, organizing killings and stuff. So he suspended all kind of amenities and pleasantries in prisons, took away all their belongings in prison, took away even their mattresses. He built one of the largest prisons in the world, and there's apparently El Salvador has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world as well. But there was a lot of approval from people, and there is now, because they were terrorized for so long. So they thought, you know what, like, there is going to be some collateral, and that collateral is controversial with human rights organizations. But as I described earlier, anything that could make life more comfortable. And so you'd have the government, like certain areas. There's an area I'm actually going to later today that's now much safer, but it's like a whole area that the army sieged, and anyone with tattoos, they had a list of tattoos, anyone with tattoos or history of gang stuff. So they were arrested, put in these mass incarceration. The term for being in gangs and having crime went from 6 to 9 years in the previous governments to 40 to 45 years. Even just having gang stuff, you can get years. Like I heard you can get 15 years in prison just with a gang sign on your kind of skin and stuff. And so it went from being complete terror to now it's one of the safest countries in all of Latin America. And he's a hero to a lot of the people. Like he has one of the highest approval rates of any president in the world. And people are so happy because there's been a change which you can't deny. And it's hard from a Western perspective to understand that. But also there's been a lot of allegations, and he has a lot of power. So he has suspended lots of constitutional things. For example, you're not allowed to run a second term consecutively. And he's done that. So he just got re-elected this year. So it's a really interesting situation, really sad past, but really fascinating, the complete change. And I haven't yet fully figured out in my mind about the current presidency. But I can't deny that now it's a safe country, people are happy. But I can't help but think what happens if he takes more power And how about those collateral people? So there's some information about El Salvador.